Your skin grows again when it peels off with burning. It seems to me to be intuitively entirely reasonable that that is a worse form of child abuse, that will give more nightmares, that will give more genuine distress, because they really believe it. If they don't believe it, it's not a problem, of course.
If you raise your children to believe in a literal hell where they will burn for eternity in hellfire and torture, if you teach your children that, I'm sorry, but you're an unethical, immoral scumbag.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way. Thank you.
Hello everybody, Magic Skeptic here, aka Magic Dara, and you're all most welcome to another episode of A Magician's Thoughts. Up for today, guys, is the discussion surrounding religion and what you might call utility. So is religion useful? Now, I've run into this quite a bit since I became an atheist all those years ago. Failing the argument to prove God's existence, people will very often retreat to a discussion surrounding whether or not religion is useful. So let's forget about whether or not God exists or not, and let's discuss the question of whether or not religion is good for society, whether or not it's useful for human beings. Now, I've run into this on my very own channel here. If you've been watching my channel for any length of time, will know that I've had a series of dialogues with Brian O'Neill, who is a lawyer and author and you might say historian. Brian is awesome. I really, really like Brian. Brian will undoubtedly watch this video. Shout out to you, Brian, my friend, and Brian and I will undoubtedly sit down for another podcast at some point. But if you've listened to those dialogues, you'll know that they have centered around this conversation, this debate about whether or not religion is useful. Brian doesn't ever really try to defend the existential question. He doesn't try to defend the existence of God. He very often and primarily pivots to the question of utility and whether or not religion serves some purpose, irrespective of the truth claim, irrespective of its truth value. And I thought it might be a good idea for me to make a video where I just address this question. Is religion useful? And if so, what is its utility? And so I'm going to be addressing multiple elements, and I've taken a lot of notes here. I've written them down here. And very often I'll just talk directly to the camera. But because this subject is quite complex and there's a lot to say, I have, as I've just said, popped down a few notes, and I'm going to be referring to those throughout. And I guess the first thing I want to say on this topic is that it's really bizarre to me. It just is really bizarre to me, right? All that should matter, in my view, is whether or not your belief is true. So I've written down a note here, and this comes directly from one of my favorite philosophers, Sam Harris, who said beliefs are not like clothing. And what he meant by that is that it's a bad idea to adopt a belief because of its comfort, because it offers some comfort, or that it offers some style or utility. They are arguably non-starters. And I agree with Sam Harris on this point. The only reason that makes sense in terms of adopting a belief is if you actually believe it, guys. If you don't really believe it, if there's no good reason to believe it, then you shouldn't be believing it, right? I mean, it just wouldn't make sense. Whatever the proposition is, right? Proposition X. Right. Let's imagine somebody believes Proposition X. And when you ask them, is there any evidence to support Proposition X? They say, no, but it's very comforting. Or no, but it's stylish. No, but it offers some use to me in my life. That is just utterly bizarre. It's just a non sequitur. And what I mean by that is those two things are just unrelated. They're just not connected. Right? And this can be demonstrated with a plethora of examples. If I told you that I believe in Santa Claus, and you looked at me after your eyebrows returned from the back of your forehead, if you asked me, but why do you believe? And I said, oh, because it makes me feel good. You'd know that I was demented. You'd know that I was just being irrational, right? There's no denying that a belief in Santa Claus, or what some people might refer to as Father Christmas, is comforting. It's a wonderful belief system. The whole idea of this chubby, whimsical and charitable man who comes once a year and gives gifts to the world's children. I mean, what's not to love about that belief? I'd love if it were all true, but unfortunately there's not a shred of evidence to support it. And the fact that it might be comforting is just frankly irrelevant. So when people start talking about utility and whether or not religion serves some purpose other than it being true, this is kind of what occurs in my mind. And I just want to be forthcoming with you off the bat before we go any further in this conversation. I do think this conversation is a nonsense, but considering how prevalent it is, considering how frequently it occurs and crops up in dialogues that I've had with Brian and others, and if you just, take a glance on Twitter and look at what theists and atheists are debating, very often it comes down again to a question about utility. I think this was a central discussion point between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris in their dialogues about religion. And so, yeah, it is really a bizarre conversation. It is very bizarre, and I have to acknowledge that. It would be remiss of me not to acknowledge that off the bat. And so now that that's out in the open, let's dive into the question, however irrational it might be, let's dive into the question about whether or not religion serves some utility. So there are so many angles to address here, and undoubtedly it's not going to be possible to capture the full scope of this debate in one video. So if I do miss something, I hope that you'll attribute the principle of charity and point it out in the comments below, and perhaps I can address it in a future video. What I would be hoping, dear listener, is that you don't jump into the comments below and say, "Ha! Magic Skeptic didn't address this part of the debate, so therefore his perspective on this is a nonsense." Please do remember that this is a very expansive discussion. And so to begin, I want to discuss the ways in which religion is utterly corrosive and not useful. And I think these examples are irrefutable, really. And so the first thing to be aware of is that religion gets in the way of science and progress, guys. That is just inarguable. So I'll give you just a couple of examples. Stem cell research and abortion rights and women's rights more generally, scientific education. These are all areas where religion gets in the way. Now, stem cell research, look, I'm not a biologist and I'm certainly not a medical professional, so you're going to have to take my thoughts on this with a pinch of salt. But my understanding is that stem cell research is a hugely promising domain of inquiry that could potentially contain cures for all sorts of very serious illnesses that we don't currently have solutions for.
Voters here in California approve one of the largest scientific endeavors in all of history.
We have in our own bodies the cells that know how to regenerate our body. We just need to know how to deliver it or improve it.
Stem cell therapies, it will transform medicine as you know it.
We will have an era of regenerative medicine that treats many more diseases than we thought. Sickle cell anemia, juvenile diabetes, lupus, multiple sclerosis, heart attack, Lou Gehrig's, AIDS, hepatitis.
This research offers a potential to eliminate diseases, literally save millions of lives.
And so the idea that we would limit research in this area and the idea that it would be limited on religious grounds really is anathema to my worldview. I think the sticking point is that stem cells are procured from fetuses and blastocysts, right? Again, if I'm mistaken on this, I'm happy to be corrected in the comments below. But of course, the religious get very shaky about this. They become very uncomfortable when it comes to fiddling with fetuses and blastocysts and so on. Because, of course, if you're a Catholic, for example, you tend to believe that life begins at the moment of conception.
Last week marked the 20th anniversary of a plea from Pope John Paul II to then U.S. President George W. Bush. In a meeting in Rome in July 2001, the 81-year-old Holy Father asked the president to reject research on human embryos, also called stem cell research. The now saint said the study devalues and violates human life. President Bush was non-committal, but said the research did have serious moral implications.
The problem is when you're extracting stem cells from a human embryo, because the process of extracting stem cells actually ends the life of the embryo, which from the church's position, it's the moral equivalent of an abortion.
Now, at the moment of conception, what you're talking about is a combination of cells. And the idea that that should be treated the exact same way as a fully developed, living, breathing human, that to me is just a nonsense. But if you'd like me to make a video about abortion, I will do that. It's just that is, quite frankly, beyond the scope of this discussion right now. Just to clarify before we move on, I personally believe it is ridiculous to limit experimentation with early onset fetuses and blastocysts and so on. These are non-living in a sense, right? They're certainly not fully developed human beings. And again, if you want to hear my full thoughts on abortion and what's permissible in terms of pro-life, pro-choice stuff, please do jump into the comments below and let me know, and I'll make a video about that. But suffice to say, religion gets in the way of stem cell research, which is a hugely promising domain of inquiry that could in fact unlock cures to various illnesses and ailments that plague humanity, and religion gets in the way of that. So that's one way in which religion doesn't serve us in terms of utility. Now, are all religions to equally blame for this? Of course not. So I've mentioned Catholics, which are one denomination of Christian. Not all Christians agree necessarily with the Catholic view, and not all religious people agree with the Christian view. So there are Muslims, for example, who have no problem with stem cell research.
Welcome to the Islamic Republic of Iran, a country known in the West for its powerful mullahs, strict dress codes for women, and long-standing nuclear ambitions. But at this laboratory on the outskirts of Tehran, there's work underway that may surprise you. Scientists here have been conducting a series of controversial experiments. Human embryonic stem cells.
Here in Iran, we have no problem to use the surplus embryos to produce cell lines and to work on embryonic stem cells.
In Iran, stem cell research wouldn't be possible without the support of its religious leaders. According to the Royan Institute, it all began in 2002 when they asked for a fatwa, or religious opinion, from Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini.
He gave us a letter and said, go after these good research and bring this wealth for our nation, and be careful making a spare part of the human, not to be making a human.
So I would say that they are not an impediment, and the reason that they are not an impediment is because they don't believe that it's a life from the moment of conception. Ensoulment, as it's referred to in the religious discourse, happens later on. I can't remember, it depends on which hadith you consult, but I think it's weeks into fetal development or blastocyst development that Muslims tend to believe that ensoulment begins. And so before that point, you can have added hos. And so, yeah, Muslims are not a barrier in this regard. I just want to be clear that I'm not painting everybody with the one brush. There is disagreement here. But the fact that any religious group gets in the way of stem cell research is a huge problem, and it definitely is an argument in favor of the idea that religion does not serve us in the scientific sense, that it does not contain utility in this domain. But I listed off a bunch of other things, and I'm going to discuss them one by one. Abortion rights, it's the same issue, right? It's the exact same issue. So I don't need to say a whole pile on this. It's the exact same problem. So those same Catholics who believe life begins at conception, they will not allow a woman to have an abortion if they had their way. And they have had their way, depending on what nation you want to refer to. Ireland is a good example. Abortion was illegal in Ireland up until very recently, and one of the reasons abortion was illegal is because of the grip that the Catholic Church held over the Irish populace. But then, of course, the church scandal came out of priests sexually abusing children, and people turned away from the church by the tens of thousands, and that's just one reason. There are many, but yeah, the Catholic Church has lost its grip on Ireland, and in a recent referendum, only in the last few years, there was a massive vote, and the overwhelming majority of people voted for abortion rights, and so that's a happy ending. But that's not a happy ending for all of the women who lived under that oppression up until that point, and unfortunately, there are other countries where that battle was lost. For example, abortion is completely illegal in El Salvador.
Human rights organizations are calling for an end to El Salvador's total ban on abortion, laws which see women and girls routinely imprisoned even after enduring stillbirths and miscarriages. On Monday, a 21-year-old woman, whom supporters say had a stillbirth, faces a retrial on charges of killing her baby. She has to prove she didn't induce an abortion. Since 1998, terminations have been banned in all circumstances, including rape, incest, and a threat to the life of the mother. Women can be sentenced for up to 50 years in jail.
San Salvador, a city where Catholicism has deep roots and where the church has had a commanding influence and helped to ensure the total ban on abortion. A ban that has criminalized women like Theodora Vasquez. She went into labor alone at work and called an ambulance, which never came. Theodora says she fainted during the birth and came to surrounded by police accusing her of killing her baby. Last year, her 30-year sentence was commuted and she walked free to be reunited with her family after a decade behind bars.
More than 75% of the country's inhabitants are practicing Catholics. That's the first thing to be aware of. The church launched a targeted and ultimately successful campaign for restrictive abortion laws in order to prevent what they saw as the unjust termination of life in defiance of religious values. And so in El Salvador right now, you can't even have an abortion if you're raped. Now, you tell me how that serves some utility, dear listener. So this comes from the Health and Human Rights Journal, and it's dated 2016. The article title, in case you want to look it up, is Human Rights Law and Abortion in El Salvador. So I'll just read briefly from the introduction and then we'll move on. In 2013, a pregnant woman named Beatriz was denied the right to a medical abortion by El Salvador's highest Supreme Court. Beatriz had lupus and kidney disease, and she was told by her medical professionals that not only would the pregnancy be potentially threatening to her health and life, but that the fetus had fatal congenital anomalies and would not survive. I think we can all see where this is going. Despite multiple human rights bodies condemning El Salvador's absolute abortion ban and the government's response to Beatriz's case, she was never granted access to a therapeutic abortion, even as her health deteriorated. It was not until 27 weeks into her pregnancy that Beatriz was granted a cesarean section. Doctors performed the same procedure as they would have for a medical abortion, with the exception that the fetus was put on life support for a few hours before dying. Anti-abortion proponents in El Salvador, including the government, ultimately deemed this outcome a victory, describing it as an induced birth in which the baby died of natural causes. Furthermore, the court delayed granting Beatriz the right to medical intervention until her pregnancy progressed beyond 26 weeks, when the procedure could legally be defined as an induced birth, despite it achieving the same intended outcomes as a medical abortion. Beatriz's case exemplifies the lack of political will to ensure women's access to safe abortion care, even in the most dire of medical circumstances, and has spurred the recent global call to action on ensuring sexual and reproductive rights to women in El Salvador. The abortion ban in El Salvador is a blatant violation of internationally recognized rights, including the right to health, life, liberty, and physical integrity. The criminalization of abortion in El Salvador denies women their rights to control their bodies and to access reproductive health services that would enable them to enjoy healthy lives. In other words, guys, in the case of Beatriz, the government risked her life, the medical community risked her life for weeks before they were willing to grant an abortion when it passed a certain threshold. So she could have died. Luckily enough, in this case, Beatriz didn't. But they gambled with her life so that the fetus could be, or so that the baby could be born later and still die anyway because it had those congenital abnormalities. I submit to you, dear listener, that this is not an example of utility in practice. I submit to you that this is an example of barbarity and just completely awful policy making. It is immoral, it is disgusting, and I don't have any other words for it. I'm running out of adjectives here. Suffice to say, this is not an example of a religion serves any utility, and I see examples like this all over the world, right? Before abortion was legalized in Ireland, there was a poor, helpless woman Savita, I believe her name was. If I get the name wrong, I'll put a correction on screen. And she died precisely under the same circumstances, right? She was not offered an abortion and she died as a consequence. That was one of the cases that spurred on the referendum in Ireland, which ultimately changed the law, I'm thankful to report. So guys, again, I'm not seeing a positive picture here, but let's keep going. So we have discussed stem cell research and the impediments that such research faces from the religious community, or some certain subsections of the religious community. We've discussed abortion rights and how religious people get in the way there. Now, they don't always get in the way. There are religious believers who will support abortion rights. I'm just pointing out that religion is inconsistent on these various questions. And the other one then that I wanted to discuss is scientific education. So, for example, it is still a struggle to teach evolution in the United States. Evolution is an established fact. For those of you now screaming at the screen saying, oh no, Magic Skeptic, it's just a theory, I'm sorry, you're under a huge misapprehension. Evolutionary theory is otherwise known as evolutionary fact. The word theory in science is used as a synonym for fact. When we discuss theories in common parlance, what we're really talking about is guesses or hypotheses. But you see, we in the general non-scientific community have disabused that word of its original scientific meaning, because the original scientific intent with the word theory is fact. When an idea reaches the status of theory, it has reached the highest possible cadence that an idea can reach in the scientific domain. So when we talk about the theory of evolution, that is the fact of evolution. I'm sure you'll agree with me, dear listener, when I say that gravity is a fact. Well, in science, gravity is explained by the theory of gravitation. So the idea that evolution is still being hotly debated in religious circles is just ridiculous. And so I have another article here. Again, I'll just read a little subsection of it. So, evolution, education, and outreach. So the title of this article, and it comes from Evolution Outreach, biomedcentral.com. Article title, Teaching Evolution in US Public Schools, a Continuing Challenge. So let me just give you the background, the abstract. Over a decade ago, the first nationally representative probability survey concerning the teaching of evolution revealed disquieting facts about evolution education in the United States. This 2007 survey found that only about 1 in 3 public high school biology teachers presented evolution consistently with the recommendations of the nation's leading scientific authorities. And about 13% of the teachers emphasized to their students that creationism was a valid scientific alternative to modern evolutionary biology. Oh my fucking Jesus Christ above. That is just utterly shocking. Not very useful, I would say. So I'll just quickly read the results in conclusion. We find substantial reductions in overtly creationist instruction and in the number of teachers who send mixed messages that legitimate creationism as a valid scientific alternative to evolutionary biology. We also report a substantial increase in the time that high school teachers devote to human evolution and general evolutionary processes. We show that these changes reflect both generational replacement from teachers who are new to the profession and changes in teaching practices among those who were teaching in the Kitzmiller era. I don't know what that's referring to. You'll have to forgive my ignorance on that one, guys. But yeah, so there's changes and welcome changes. And then the conclusion. Adoption of the next generation science standards, along with improvements in pre-service teacher education and in-service teacher professional development, appears to have contributed to a large reduction in both creationist instruction and mixed messages that could lead students to think that creationism is a scientific perspective. Combined with teachers devoting more hours to evolution, including human evolution, instruction at the high school level has improved by these measures since the last national survey in 2007. So that's a positive article, isn't it? It's showing development, but it's clear from the wording that the battle is far from over, right? And so again, religion is serving as an impediment to students simply learning about established facts. Established scientific facts. The idea that a teacher would present creationism as a valid alternative is just absolutely shocking to me. So guys, these examples, and we could discuss many more, are just absolutely ridiculous. They serve as powerful evidence, I would say, that religion is not useful. It just isn't, right? It gets in the way of scientific progress, education, and medical development. It also gets in the way of women's rights when it comes to the abortion issue, right? These are issues that can't be ignored. These are problems that are massive gaping holes in the idea that religion serves some form of utility. But let's go a little bit further, because some people will say, but Magic Skeptic, you've sidestepped the primary utility, which is one of comfort. Religion's primary utility is that it comforts people, right? Now, I've had this conversation with Brian O'Neill. I've also discussed this with PJ on the channel, and I've been thinking about it for a very long time. And at best, I can say that on the question of comfort and whether or not religion serves utility in this regard, the best I can concede, the most I can admit to, is that religion is inconsistent on this question. I don't think a religious adherent can say that it's just a slam dunk victory in terms of utility when it comes to the comfort question, because it very much is a mixed bag. And I've got some evidence to support that. So I've taken the liberty of going to the mentalhealthforum.net. And I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but there's an entire domain of inquiry called religious trauma syndrome. And people receive counseling for this all the time. I was reading through the forums there, and people were, explaining their own feelings towards religion and their beliefs and how they currently feel and whether or not their beliefs offer them comfort. Here's just one comment. Now, admittedly, it's just one comment, and this is anecdotal, but it serves as a launch pad for the point that I'm hoping to make here. This, I can assure you, is a real comment. I haven't invented this for the sake of scoring a point in my favor here. This comment is deeply troubling, and I quote, "The fear of going to hell, to burn and suffer day and night with no rest, petrifies me. I wish God would have mercy on me and kill my soul so I don't experience eternal torture." I'm going to read that one more time and let this sink in. "The fear of going to hell, to burn and suffer day and night with no rest, petrifies me. I wish God would have mercy on me and kill my soul so I don't experience eternal torture." Now, that's just one anecdotal account. But if you want to go to the Mental Health Forum and look up religious trauma syndrome, you will find hundreds, if not thousands, of similar accounts. Guys, this is no joke. The people in this world who are hopelessly convinced by this, the people who really and truly believe in God and heaven and hell and all the rest of it, and there's a lot of those people on the planet, many of them live in unbelievable fear that they're going to burn forever in hellfire and torture. Now, forgive me for saying so, but that is not useful. That doesn't confer any utility in somebody's life. That makes somebody's life miserable. This is a form of psychological torture. It is this that led Richard Dawkins to say, and I agree with him, that to raise children with beliefs like this is in fact child abuse, a form of psychological child abuse.
It seems to me that telling children such that they really, really believe that people who sin are going to go to hell and roast forever, that your skin grows again when it peels off with burning. It seems to me to be intuitively entirely reasonable that is a worse form of child abuse that will give more nightmares, that will give more genuine distress because they really believe it. If they don't believe it, it's not a problem, of course.
If you raise your children to believe in a literal hell where they will burn for eternity in hellfire and torture, if you teach your children that, I'm sorry, but you're an unethical, immoral scumbag. And I do agree with the idea that that is child abuse. And this mental health forum is filled with accounts just like this one. So guys, even though I would have to concede that some people are comforted by the idea that, oh, I'm going to go to heaven and see my loved ones again, for every one of those, there's somebody else, it would seem, that is terrified about the possibility that they're going to go to hell. And so forgive me, but I cannot just grant a point in the favor of religion here and say that it serves some utility when it comes to the question of comfort. It just doesn't. It's inconsistent at best. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to say on that point other than I hope, dear listener, that you're not one of those people who suffers with this mental anguish. Now, I want to extend an olive branch here because what I've done for the first section of this video really is essentially argue against the utility of religion, and I've not given it a very fair hearing, you might suggest. All I've done is focus on the negative, right? What I want to do now is, you know, as I said, extend an olive branch, because I'm not denying that religion could at one point in history have served some utility. My view, if you want to know it in detail, is that I think we've basically outgrown it. At one point in history, it was useful, but not anymore. To convey this point, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I'm going to read a subsection from Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, because I think he nails it here. Now, I'm not saying that I know what he says here to be true. This is a hypothesis. I'm telling you it's a hypothesis. I'm not saying I can prove this. I'm telling you my suspicion. If you hold my feet to the fire on this, I'm going to hold my hands up and say, I don't know for sure if this is true, but I find this point persuasive. And so I'm going to read this and you can be the judge. And this is what Richard Dawkins says. Perhaps the feature we are interested in, religion in this case, doesn't have a direct survival value of its own, but is a byproduct of something else that does. I find it helpful to introduce the byproduct idea with an analogy from my own field of animal behavior. Moths fly into the candle flame, and it doesn't look like an accident. They go out of their way to make a burnt offering of themselves. We could label it self-immolation behavior, and, under that provocative name, wonder how on earth natural selection could favor it. My point is that we must rewrite the question before we can even attempt an intelligent answer. It isn't suicide. Apparent suicide emerges as an inadvertent side effect or byproduct of something else. A byproduct of what? Well, here's one possibility which will serve to make the point. Artificial light is a recent arrival on the night scene. Until recently, the only night lights on view were the moon and the stars. They are at optical infinity, so rays coming from them are parallel. This fits them for use as compasses. Insects are known to use celestial objects, such as the sun and the moon, to steer accurately in a straight line. So in other words, guys, the moth uses a celestial object at optical infinity in order to steer itself, right? So the moon is an optical infinity, which means that no matter what angle you turn or no matter what direction you face, the ray coming from the moonlight is going to remain the same, right? So it's a useful guide in the night sky. A moth can orient itself with the moon here and it going forward. And as long as the ray stays here, the moth knows it's traveling in a straight line. Obviously, this wouldn't be happening at a conscious level. Its nervous system has evolved to use this celestial light and the emerging light rays as an orientation mechanism to fly in a straight line. Why does this matter? Well, I'll allow Richard Dawkins to explain. And I quote, "But the light compass relies critically on the celestial object being at optical infinity. If it isn't, the rays are not parallel, but diverge like the spokes of a wheel. A nervous system applying a 30-degree or any acute angle rule of thumb to a nearby candle as though it were the moon at optical infinity will steer the moth via a spiral trajectory into the flame." So now that there is artificial light in the nighttime, the moth has not successfully evolved yet to account for that difference. And so when the moth mistakes a candlelight for a celestial object like the moon, the candlelight is not at optical infinity, and as the moth flies straight, with the candle being here, obviously the candle's light will change because they're going to be passing by the candle, which is going to require them to turn to keep the candlelight at the same angle. And that results in an elliptical and shrinking orbit until they crash into the flame, and there you get your self-immolation behavior. And again, I'll continue reading. Though fatal in this particular circumstance, the moth's rule of thumb is still, on average, a good one because, for a moth, sightings of candles are rare compared with sightings of the moon. So again, this mechanism that's in the brain of the moth, that's in the nervous system of the moth, once served a very important function. Again, keeping the moth traveling in a straight line, in a straight trajectory so that it didn't become lost. Obviously, that mechanism once served utility. Now that there is artificial light, that very same mechanism can lead to the self-immolation of the moth. The point is that perhaps religion is the same. Religion once served some utility, and now in our modern circumstance, it no longer serves that same utility. So what is the utility that was once useful and now isn't? Well, Richard Dawkins hypothesizes that it has something to do with our subservience and blind belief in what our elders and authorities tell us. So again, I'll read. But, to say the least, there will be a selective advantage to child brains that possess the rule of thumb. Believe, without question, whatever your grown-ups tell you. Obey your parents, obey the tribal elders, especially when they adopt a solemn, minatory tone. Trust your elders without question. This is a generally valuable rule for a child. But as with the moths, it can go wrong. In other words, if you are evolved with the mechanism in your brain, believe your elders, trust your parents, whatever they tell you, it's true. Why is that useful in most cases? Because they're going to tell you, don't put your hand in the fire. Don't jump off the cliff. Right? Make sure you go out and gather some wood. Make sure you go out and gather some food. Be responsible. But then among those commands and among that repository of suggestions from your elders, also included there is going to be the obey God. Make sure you pray 5 times a day if you're a Muslim. Make sure you apologize and get forgiveness for your sins. Right? You're going to heaven. You need to avoid hell. This is what you need to do to avoid hell, etc., etc., etc. So this historically valuable utility of merely trusting your elders also produces belief systems and structures where people are more likely to believe something that's not true. Because as a child brain, you can't distinguish between the claims that are true and the claims that are false, because the mechanism in your mind is just trust everything, believe everything. Because if a brain didn't operate that way, you'd be the kind of child who did put their hand in the fire or jump off the cliff, because you weren't doing what you were told. So it is better, evolutionarily speaking, and for survival, for the child brain to simply trust all commands that come from on high. And obviously, many of those commands can be religious. And so I think it's a very interesting explanation. So yes, religion probably got conferred in that manner. And religions themselves are repositories of certain ethical behaviors that can be useful, right? So, for example, when it says in the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, those are undoubtedly useful commands. And so, yeah, we take them from on high, happy days. But then it also says stone homosexuals, and you can enslave people, and that women should remain quiet and stay at home, and so on and so forth. And so again, there's good ethical commands in there and there's bad ethical commands. So for anybody who wanted to make the point about, oh, religion gives us morality, yeah, it does. It can be a delivery mechanism for morality, but the morality that it delivers is very inconsistent. It delivers some good rules, like the golden rule, albeit that doesn't originate with Christianity or any other religion. That's an ancient rule that we seem to find in any or all societies. The thou shalt not kill, again, seems to be a cultural universal, doesn't come or originate with Christianity. But unfortunately, these rules that we all agree with come coupled with the despicable rules, like the Bible's support for slavery, or the Bible's subordinate position that it attributes to women, right? And the stoning of homosexuals and all of this barbaric nonsense. And so there's a huge problem here. It might have served some utility at one point in history, and the mechanism that caused us to believe it might be something like believe your elders, but it seems to me that we've outgrown it. We have outgrown it. We don't need it anymore. I'm not a religious person, and there are many non-religious societies, and they're not falling apart at the seams. Look at the Scandinavian countries. They seem to be doing quite well for themselves, and the majority of denizens of any of those nations are atheists. They're non-religious people. And again, the wheels are not coming off of the project of their civilizations. They seem to be doing just fine. This idea that we need religion for a functioning society doesn't seem to hold water. So guys, in closing, I want to make just a couple of remarks. And no doubt, despite all of the arguments I've put forth in this video, some of you will still say, oh, but I know this person who needs religion. I know this person who needs their faith, and without it, they'd be a shadow of their former self. the word need there is an interesting word to use, but I'm not convinced that that's the case. Yes, if you raise someone and hopelessly indoctrinate them into a belief system, it might be too late for some of them to pull the carpet from under their feet. But that doesn't mean they needed it from the word go. They might need it now because they've been hopelessly indoctrinated. What I'm articulating is the idea that had that person been raised from birth without this crutch, then there's no good reason to suppose that they'd need it later on in life. Again, look at those Scandinavian countries where people are raised usually as atheists. They don't have any pressing need for religiosity. They seem to be getting on just fine, right? And so I think personally that it's condescending to allege that some people need religion, because what that really means is, oh, well, I don't need it, but I think other people do. I think that really is condescending. I mean, I used to be a fundamentalist in my creationist beliefs, and I thought I needed it too, and yet here I am now, and I don't need it anymore because I saw the light, as it were. The idea that somebody or anybody needs it, I think, is a bit silly. And we don't... To say that somebody needs it, you'd need to prove this with the counterfactual. You'd have to show me a society without religion that is clearly suffering in the absence of it. But nobody can do that, because the societies that don't have religion seem, on balance, to be doing as good, if not better, than other religious societies. And look at the flip side of this coin. Look at the societies that are most religious on earth. Countries like Saudi Arabia. They don't appear to be bastions of human prospering, right? They seem to be places that I frankly wouldn't want to live, and I would imagine that you wouldn't want to live either, dear listener, right? And so this idea that somebody needs it, I think is just not true. It doesn't hold water. It just amounts to a condescending assertion. But if somebody has evidence for why we need it, I'm all ears. Feel free to tell me. And so, yeah, there's lots of ways in which people suggest religion has utility. People say that it has utility in terms of comfort. As I said, I think that's inconsistent. People say it has utility in terms of spreading morality. But again, as you saw, I think it's very inconsistent in that regard. The only question that I haven't discussed in depth here is the question of art and poetry and so on and so forth. But even then, I would say it's inconsistent there, because there are many examples of Christians and Muslims destroying art that differed from their philosophical and religious convictions. And so, again, it's just inconsistent all the way down, guys. And again, it misses the main point, which is there's no evidence that this is true to begin with. And so to have a conversation about utility really is anathema. I mean, imagine we were talking about whether or not Nazi claims are true. And I responded to you and said, but what about the utility of Nazism? Now, you might not want to agree with this, dear listener, but there's evidence that Nazism had utility. There was an immense amount of technological innovation under Hitler and the Nazis. The Autobahn, for example, comes to mind, right? But there are lots of other examples and ways in which the Nazis engaged in technological innovation, which serves some utility. But how obscene is that as a discussion about Nazism? Clearly, Nazism is a failed ideology. Its claims are bogus. It's abhorrent, disgusting, racist, and bigoted. And that's the end of it. It doesn't serve utility in the general sense. And to the point that you can cherry pick, to the extent that you can cherry pick, who gives a shit? Nazism is irrelevant, and nobody should be supporting it. Now, I'm not comparing religiosity with Nazism. That would be very unfair. Please don't misunderstand the comparison. I'm comparing at the level of principle. Sure, you can find minute, small examples of utility here and there in religion and religiosity, but those examples of utility are inconsistent at best, or at least that's what I've certainly tried to demonstrate and prove in this video. So in closing, guys, I want to leave you with a quotation from George Bernard Shaw, who was an Irish playwright, critic, polemicist, and political activist. And George Bernard Shaw said the following: "The fact that a believer is happier than a skeptic is no more to the point than the fact that a drunken man is happier than a sober one." I think George Bernard Shaw's words there show remarkable and penetrating insight regarding this particular conversation. But look, maybe you disagree, and if you do, jump into the comments below and let me know what I got wrong. Tell me what I got wrong. I would love to hear it. And Other than that, guys, thank you very much for watching this video. Make sure you drop a like in it, subscribe if this was your first visit to the channel, and don't forget to check the bell notification icon, because that way you'll be able to stay up to date with all things on the channel, and you'll even be notified as and when my latest videos go live. Thanks again for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. All the best. Bye-bye.